May I start with a question about your involvement in FM and perhaps where you heard first the term facilities management?
Hello, Joanna. It's a delight to be interviewed by you. I couldn't have asked for anything better. The term I heard first in America.
Right.
Now that probably doesn't surprise you, and I will need to explain that a little bit, and that might come later. But I worked in New York in the very early 70s, and probably I was there for only 2 years. They were very formative years in my career, if you like.
As an architect, though?
Oh yes,
yeah.
As an architect. Let me make that quite clear. I have never ever been a facilities manager. And what I've always said to people, you included, I would be the worst facilities manager in the world. Now, I came across the term because I worked in New York for a firm called ISD, which is Interior Space Designers. Now, at that time in New York, it was the centre of the interior design and possibly office design industry. It's changed now. A lot of it has moved to London. But at that time, I went to New York because that's where it was happening.
And you were there for 2 years?
Only 2 years,
and
yes.
Did you come back to the UK after that?
Yep.
And what did you bring back about facilities management?
I brought back my first knowledge of it.
Yes.
That there were professional people who looked after the running of a building. Now, I chose those words carefully because the facilities manager in New York didn't look after and was not involved in the creation of a building, but they were running it. And I found it useful that there was somebody like that you could talk to, because I was looking after very big schemes. When I went and I was given my first job to look after in Memphis, what would it have been? 500,000 or more square feet. I mean, a huge thing. So I actually had to come to terms with that change in scale. But that's why I had gone, because I couldn't get that sort of experience here. I came back. I worked for another firm just for 1 year. And then I set up my own firm, which, as you know, is called Trickett Associates. And I set it up with no clients and no projects, with nothing, except the idea that I would do it. The timing was absolutely fine, because the problems that New York and the States were facing, and they had begun to solve them, were just becoming paramount in the UK. Now, I'll define what those problems were. They were managements losing control of their buildings, managements not having any idea how to define a brief for a new building, managements having no idea why people were so unhappy working in the premises that they had. All those problems are absolute paramount in the 70s when I came back to the UK.
So do you feel that you were a pioneer in the UK in developing the ideal workplace solution?
I was, and I wasn't the only one. Let me explain that a little bit, because I'd probably only been working at Trickett Associates for 6 months, and I had a phone call. I had a phone call from a person called George Young, who used to work in the building which is adjacent to this one, which was owned and built by YRM, which is a firm called York, Rosenberg and Mardell, a well-known firm of architects. Now, he didn't phone me as an architect. He actually was the administrator for YRM, and strangely enough, their facilities manager. And he phoned me up because he'd heard that I was beginning to get jobs for IBM and various big companies like that. And they were inevitably the companies that were going to employ me. And on the grapevine, he'd heard that I was doing this, and he wanted me to join a committee of which he was chairman, and it was called the Office Design Committee of the Institute of Administrative Management. Now that was the start of me getting involved, if you like, in what we now call facilities management. And that Office Design Committee did rather good work. We organised and ran the Office of the Year Award, and members of the committee took turns, if you like, to be the chairman. I think it happened every 2 years, not every year.
How did your experience of what this term facilities management reflect in the work that you were doing? What was the added value? What was the extra dimension?
I'll explain. But I have to be careful here because we still haven't got to a point in time when the word facilities manager was used.
Exactly.
So, I was mentioning that I was this rather strange beast, an architect who appeared to understand how companies worked. Now, in the 70s and 80s, this was a little bit unusual. Now, every architect in the world says, oh, we understand all that, space boundary, all that, I mean, no problem at all. But when I started, there would only have been 12 people at the most who were saying that.
Yes.
Now that, from a sales pitch point of view, was a much more effective position to be in, because it meant that if I was asked to put in a proposal, and as you know, it's always hard work doing a proposal, and then I would give a presentation, that there was possibly a 1 in 3 chance that I was going to get the job. Now you know that life is not like that anymore.
Terry, you've had a very interesting career. Can you take me on a quick walk through what's happened up to the present day, but talk about where FM has interjected into your career so that we can understand that?
This is the key question.
It is.
To which we've been leading.
Yes.
I remember a very interesting discussion. I've told you about the Office Design Committee of the IAM, and it did valuable work, and that award was the predecessor of the current BIFM awards. So it's interesting that I'm the only one that has worked on both, as I'm sure you realise.
Yeah.
But there was an interim stage between that committee's existence and the BIFM's existence. I suppose it was in the 80s that this interim stage happened. And I remember that at the time, this same group of people that I described to you got round a table and they said, well, there seems to be a need now to set up something which is concerned professionally with this particular arm of administrative management. In other words, without saying the word facilities, they were getting at it. And I remember this discussion, and Roger Henderson at that time was instrumental in starting it. And he said, I think something like the Institute of Managing Buildings or whatever should be set up. He refused to mention the word facilities. And round the table, we were all saying, well, what's the name of it? It has to have a name which means something. And Roger said, well, I refuse to have the name facilities. I think that's an American word. I don't think anybody understands what it means. Now, my viewpoint, which I put at that time, was the opposite. I said, it doesn't matter whether it's a strange or alien word at the moment. It's actually the only word that really describes what it is. And the fact that it's used by our American colleagues is really a very good reason for saying, okay, let's take that word and use it for ourselves. And of course that decision held. And there was a sort of interim period when I believe an Institute of Facilities Management was set up. Yes. And that was the immediate precursor to BIFM. And it was at a time when I was getting very, very intimately involved in what was called Big Bang in the city.
Yes.
And I was literally involved in big schemes for Schroeder, various other companies, setting up new dealing floors for them, designing new furniture for them, so that they could actually operate in the new way that Big Bang required. Now that was an extremely interesting time, and can I sidetrack, because it's all on the
Please.
A facilities management issue. Let me take one example, and I'm deliberately not going to name the company, but it's a household name in the city. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but we were interviewed to set up a big job in Cutler's Gardens, which you and I know quite well, and they had taken 2 floors. Now this is interesting for 2 facilities management reasons, very important ones. In advance of Schroeder showing an interest in this building, I had developed a relationship with Greycoat Estates. Now this is very significant because up until that time, all these different professional activities like property development, property management, architecture, surveying, were all in their separate compartments. And it wasn't doing anybody any good, because it meant that a place like Cutler's Gardens would be developed, and there wouldn't have been any forethought on how that building was going to be used properly for potential clients. Now, Greycoat were ahead of the game. In other words, you know that it was run at that time by Stuart Lipton, and he, of course, was always ahead of the game. And it led, through a discussion, through their agents, to me getting a very, very unusual job which I had created, which is not so unusual now, but then was amazingly unusual. I was employed by the developers to provide an initial space planning service to any potential tenants that took an interest in Cutler's Gardens.
Oh, yes.
Now this is a very interesting concept. And the reason they did this, although you can't believe it now, Cutler's Gardens was then seen to be on the edge of the city and therefore not so desirable. That obviously is no longer the case.
So it was an added value to attract people.
And the idea was that when the various Lloyd's underwriters, sniffing around looking for new space, came to look at sniffily at Cutler's Gardens, because it was a tiny bit cheaper, only a little bit, than the square mile. It was just outside the square mile. They would say to the agent, I don't see how we could fit in here. You know, it's got, I don't know, you know, the windows don't look right. Lighting's not very good. And the agent said, well, we've got a suggestion for you. Why don't you let Trickett come along, find out about your company, and then he will match what he finds out with space at Cutler's Gardens, and he'll show you the result. And you can decide whether you fit or whether you don't fit. Now this was a brilliant idea.
An absolutely wonderful marketing tool too.
It was a New York idea, which is why I put it forward. That concept wasn't alien in New York. And it worked. So whenever we provided a planning service, nearly always the tenant took the space. So everybody was happy, Greycoat were happy, the agents were happy, and of course we did the follow-on work in moving that tenant into the space, doing the planning and design for them.
So strategic FM innovation.
It was not bad.
Yeah.
It was not bad.